Hi, everybody. Bill De La Cruz here, and you're listening to the Origination Point podcast, or you're watching the Origination Point podcast. And this podcast was created to share thoughts, ideas, perspectives on a large variety of topics. The origination point is the idea that everything that we experience as adult was created between birth and high school, sometime in our adolescence. And that's the origination point of our biases, our judgments, our stereotypes, the messages that we get about ourselves and about each other. And that's really the point of healing and understanding. And so I've been doing this series of podcasts titled Is DEI Dead? Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. And it's rooted in this idea that everything needs to evolve, including this work. And I've been working in this space for 25 years. Never called it diversity, equity, inclusion. I've just talked about it from the perspective of how do we connect with each other? How do we rehumanize ourselves to each other? And frankly, I'm really happy that that's been my approach, because as this work has become politicized and people from all sides of the aisle have co-opted it and used it in ways that supports their narrative, either why it's important to count people or why it's not important to count people, I've managed to stay out of that fray, because my approach has always been humanistic centered, where I've always approached it from who are you as a person? Where do your stories come from? How can I get to know more about your story versus whether or not I agree with your perspective or your ideology? So I don't think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is dead. I do believe it needs to change, fundamentally change in a variety of ways. The most important is we have to stop counting people. We have to make people count. The counting people is the way that we create divisiveness. And I've worked in a very large educational institution called Denver Public Schools, where focusing on people created this dynamic where, while the district was hiring for more racial diversity, and this is over 10 years ago, the folks who were white in the school district would tell me things like, gosh, I'm sure glad I have my job, because I don't know if I'm the right color to be hired for this position today. And then people who were not white were hired in these positions, and within months, some of them were repositioned in the organization because it was found that they didn't have the competencies for the position that they were put in. Not to say that they were inept or bad people. It was just that this approach of hiring based on identity, and in this case, race, in some ways overlooked the competencies that were required for that particular role. So we have to stop doing that. We have to move to a competency base and stop looking at either do they fit, which in most cases means do you look, act, and talk like us, or do you bring some level of diversity, which again puts that person in a really awkward position. We need to stop judging, blaming, and shaming each other for what are normal parts of our shared humanity. And by that, what I mean is that we all, well, let me put it to you this way. Every living, breathing human being on the planet, we all have biases, we all judge, we all have stereotypes, and we all categorize. And if people say they don't, it's probably for a couple reasons. One is that they're completely unaware of it, and the other is that they feel a sense of shame or blame or guilt because they actually do that. And so what we really have to do as practitioners and facilitators and in folks doing this work is to stop blaming, shaming, and judging each other for what is a normal part of our shared humanity. We all learn things about ourselves and other groups, typically in our homes and in our communities early on, just by how our parents talk about, quote unquote, those people, or how we are labeled one of those people because we're told we're lazy or we are overweight or because we are in some way message that we want to hand out or that we don't care. You pick any message that you have heard as an adult or that you get emotionally charged when you see it in others. I will bet that there's a connection between something you heard, learned, or experienced between birth and high school. That's what the origination point is about. And so it used to be that when we talked about biases, especially, it was something that was abhorrent and that would never change. And now we know that's not true. It's that biases are a normal part of our shared humanity, and they actually can be deconstructed if we're willing to do our healing and understanding. And the thing about biases, which I find quite fascinating, is that regardless of where people find themselves on the spectrum, and those of you who know me, I don't like labels. I'm going to use them just for the purpose of a descriptor. And that is that regardless of whether someone labels themselves anywhere from being a liberal to being a conservative, I have heard people who have those identities say we all have biases. And so for me, that's a connecting point. And the other part of what we need to shift in this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion is to stop creating environments where we shut down the conversation. And the way the conversation gets shut down is when we label each other. When I have a white person come into my workshop and their first question is this going to be another one of those workshops or conversations where I'm going to be called a racist because I'm white? I know that somewhere in their history, they went to a workshop where someone told them that all white people are racist, or if you're white, you're part of the problem. And I think that's a false narrative, and it disengages people from the conversation. And the reality is that what we're doing with that behavior is we're doing what I've been fighting against my whole life. So I've been fighting against people seeing me as you see me, as a non-white person, someone who defines himself as a mestizo, someone who has brown skin, someone who has native background, and not judging me based on how people group me. And yet, for some reason today, in this space of diversity, equity, inclusion work, we can look at white people and for some reason say, all white people are this. And it logically doesn't make any sense to me, because if that's what I'm fighting against in how I don't want people to see or treat me, why is it suddenly okay to do that to a whole nother group of people? And so we have to stop doing that. We have to stop approaching this from a judgment, blame, or shame or guilt perspective, because that disengages people from the conversation. And I want people to stay in the conversation, even if it's a brand new baby experience that you're just having, that you've never really thought about the impact of your judgments and stereotypes and biases, or you never even really acknowledge that you have them. I remember a workshop I did years ago, and a gentleman came in, and we had already started the workshop. He was probably an hour late, and he came in and he said, I'm not really sure why I'm here because I don't have any biases. And the groups had already gotten into small groups and had started doing a bias conversation where they share a bias and talk to each other about it and share the story. And I said, there's a small group over there. Why don't you just go ahead and join them? And the folks in that group will bring you up to speed and kind of embrace you in the conversation. So he jumped in the conversation. We finished up about 30 minutes later, and he came back to me 30 minutes later, and he looked at me and he said, my gosh, I have hundreds of biases. And so within a period of 30 minutes, he walked in the door thinking he didn't have any biases to realizing that he had hundreds of them. And they were impacting his life when he interacted with people from that group. That's what self-awareness is. It's just being aware. And I congratulated him for tapping into his humanity, because that's a normal part of all of our humanity. We all have biases. We all judge, we all stereotype, and we all categorize. That's how we've we've created these shortcuts for getting to know each other. So I have these 4 boxes in my head. They're called categories, judgments, stereotypes, and biases. And I meet somebody new. And right away, consciously or unconsciously, for me now it's more conscious, I'm processing where does this person fit in my box of bias, stereotypes, judgments, and categories. And early on this journey, I did it unconsciously. And I wasn't even aware of the negative impact. Today, I do it less because what I realize is the boxes that I'm putting you into are based on people who reflect you from my past experiences and have nothing to do with who you are. So I'm judging you by how you're dressed, or I'm categorizing you based on how I see you from an age perspective, from a racial perspective, a gender perspective. I'm stereotyping you based on experiences that I've had with people who look like you, based on any one of those identities, or even a made up identity, because when I'm doing this, I'm also making assumptions or creating stories about who you are. And I may have a bias against you because of a real experience I had with somebody from your group 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So it's really important to shift out of judgment, shame, blame, and guilt and normalize this conversation. And I will tell you that I've had success with this all over the country with people who represent every ideological perspective from that liberal to conservative. And I've had a great conversation because I'm not judging, shaming, blaming. I'm not grouping people and saying you're an ism. And I'm really, really, really searching for connecting points. So a point for having a conversation. So bias awareness is a connecting point because everyone knows what it feels like to be looked at and labeled. Everyone knows and has had an experience where they've been demeaned or dehumanized based on how somebody has seen them. So really becoming aware and normalizing this conversation and moving away from terms like systemically racist. You're in a systemically racist system. I think that's one of those terms that causes people to disengage. Now, it doesn't mean that the systems that we operate in are not impacted by race. They absolutely are, just like they're impacted by gender and age and ability and disability. The challenge with the term systemic racism is once again is it has become politically co-opted. And in that co-opting, the political folks from all sides of the aisle are pushing it out from this perspective that it means that everyone who is in that system is a racist. So when people hear the term systemic racism, in their mind, they're processing it as you're calling me a racist, and it shuts down the conversation. And so for me, the other part of this approach that has to change, which I'm fine with, is that if the language that we're using causes an emotional charge in somebody and causes them to disengage from the conversation, I can either blame them or I can change my language. So I've chosen to change my language, and I use the term systemic biases because that's really what is at play, is that as individuals, we're bringing all of our biases into an organizational culture, whether it's called a workplace, a church, a community group, a friends group. And then through that, consciously or unconsciously, we create these systemic biases. So if we're going to disrupt systemic biases, we have to disrupt personal biases. And so again, we have to start with the personal and not go right to, let's talk about your workplace. Because then we run the risk of pushing people right into blame and judgment and also being a victim. Well, it's because my workplace is this. It's not a reflection of, well, it's because I'm bringing these biases in and they're showing up in this way in my workplace. And so I think it's really important to start to look at the language that we're using. And if it's emotionally triggering, I'm going to change it because it's more important for me to keep people engaged in the conversation. And like I said, I have a very successful track record in all parts of this country, from the most red, blue, purple, and every color in between community, having these conversations with this approach. And I will tell you, the connecting points in most everywhere that I have gone are rooted somewhere between faith and family. If I can connect with somebody from those perspectives, we can have a great conversation. So family is family. Who's your family? What do you want for your family? How do you approach family? How do you define family? And faith is everything from being an atheist to going to church every day of the week, because we have to recognize the spectrum of everybody within those groups and creating a connecting point so that people can have a sense of belonging. That's what counting, making people count, that's what it looks like. Making people count means that I'm able to make a connection with you without demeaning, dehumanizing, or in some way denigrating your starting point, your perspective, your ideology. The other point I think is really important to make is that this is highly emotional work. And I have met a lot of practitioners who are intellectually smart about the work without an understanding of the emotionality that is being brought into any approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. In other words, they haven't prepared themselves for the highly emotionally charged outcomes that are a part of this work, from people being angry to crying to screaming to yelling to fear to every emotion that we have as human beings. And here's why. What I realize is that when I go into these spaces to have these conversations, I'm asking people to go to these little dark crevices, these little dark recesses within our being that we don't normally talk about. Very few of us, myself included, lead into a conversation with somebody new and say, hey, let's talk about our biases. Let's talk about our stereotypes. Let's talk about how we're judging each other. We don't do that. It's not a normalized part of our conversation. However, we are unconsciously judging, stereotyping, and may have biases against each other without even being aware of it. And so when I go into this space, I know that that's going to be highly emotional for pretty much everybody. And so I have to know how to work people through emotionally charged situations, because it's a really important concept, is that the learning and the personal change process and growth does not come from up here. It comes from our heart. It comes from people in the space having an emotionalized experience. And an emotionalized experience doesn't mean that I'm the one who has to be emotional. It could be that the person sitting next to me or the person across the room starts crying or gets angry or in some way exhibits some level of emotion. It permeates the whole space. Everyone feels it. And when people feel emotion, it changes the way that we have an experience. And so for me, my approach to facilitation is to purposefully guide people in a way that allows them to have some level of emotionality. Because again, that's the place of awareness and that's the place of change. When practitioners who do this, who are unskilled in moving people through emotionality, they get people emotionally charged, and then those people walk out the door emotionally charged, and then they give it to somebody else, or they walk out so emotionally charged and say, I'm never going back to one of these workshops again. And I've had organizations call me who said, we had somebody come in 2 years ago, and I think they made things worse. They got everybody emotionally charged and they labeled everybody. And now nobody wants to do this work. They don't trust anybody. They don't want to have these conversations. And I've literally spent 3 to 4 months with an organization just getting them to trust that I'm not going to do that to them, that that's not my approach. And it's both done in person, it's done over Zoom. And it's sad. It saddens me because I think this is such great work. And I think the approach is so impactful. I think this work is so impactful that it saddens me that people leave with such a disheartening experience that it causes them to not want to come back into the conversation. And so if you're a facilitator of this work, think about that piece if you think of nothing else. How are you handling the emotionality of people as they come into your space? So for me, I look at it as kind of an arc where they come in here and I want to take them deeper and deeper and deeper into vulnerability and vulnerability-based trust and emotionality. I want them to hit a peak down here where they feel something deeply emotional, deeply vulnerable and personal. And then over the course of our time together, I bring them back up out of that highly charged emotionality to where they now start to think about, what are my next steps? Because when we're deep in emotionality, anything over a 3 in terms of a scale of 0 to 10, the ability to logically accept and understand what I'm doing or what I need to do go way down because we're too much in our emotion. So when I take people emotionally to a 6 or 7 or 8 or a 10, or someone else does that because they get angry or they start crying, I want to make sure that for the most part, people don't leave any higher than a 2, which means that we have to process through all that emotion. We have to recognize it. We have to acknowledge that it's in our space. I have to give people time to talk about what they're feeling right now, what they felt when they saw that sudden surge of emotionality. And so that's probably one of the most important factors that I found, because intellectually anybody could talk about the definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, or what a bias is. It's implicit or it's explicit. It takes another level of expertise to walk with people through the process of awareness, action, accountability, and sustainability in terms of how we work through biases, judgments, stereotypes, and categorizing each other. And so I'm entering into this topic because I think it's really important. And frankly, I'm really tired of the political system taking a profession that I really value and that I've seen the positive impact from over the last 20 plus years, and co-opting the message and creating false narratives and talking to people as if what they're saying is true. Somebody has to create a counter narrative. And that's what I'm doing, is creating a counter narrative. I'm happy to talk to anyone about this topic. So if you have an interest in having a deeper conversation, let me know. If you have feedback or comments that are not demeaning or dehumanizing, you can reach out at delacruzleadershipsolutions.com. The reason why I say if you have comments that aren't demeaning or dehumanizing is that when I start to read comments like that, I won't read them, because that's more a reflection of the person sharing the comment than it is of the words that I'm sharing with you. And my approach is to create a dynamic where we can actually have a conversation with each other where you're open to a new perspective, just as I have to be open to your perspective when you share a comment with me. And so that will just play out as it goes. We will just see what kind of feedback comes as I continue to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. I've got a call out to folks who want to be interviewed on this podcast to talk about their experiences. And so my ultimate goal is just to get you to think about diversity, equity, inclusion from a different lens, and to think about the impact of it, and to engage with each other in a way that allows you to see and be your most authentic self, and to see the other person as their most authentic self. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you watching. If this resonates with you, subscribe, reach out to us, and most importantly, keep growing. Take care.